Hi there and welcome back. This is Jennifer McGuire. So today's video or episode is another long one, but I'm sharing lots of ways to creatively use embossing folders. So embossing folders are inexpensive and provide wonderful texture. And today I'll show you ways to step it up and create new looks for your cards. Now, I've done videos on creatively using embossing folders in the past, and I'll link to them here in case you want to check those out also. Today, I am focusing on using some of the new 3D embossing folders that are available. Tim Holtz has some new ones that are great, and this one's my favorite. It's the Botanical 3D embossing folder. And what's neat about these is that there's not just raised areas and flat areas, there's in between. So you get really cool three-dimensional looks, and you'll see it in a moment. Now, these embossing folders work with most of your die cut machines. I'm using my Sizzix Big Shot Express today, and I will set this up to work as if I was using a regular embossing folder. However, we're going to leave out a cutting plate, which I'll show you in a moment. I like to use tab 1 for my Sizzix Big Shot, but you'll just want to play around with whatever die cut machine you may have. Now that I have my machine set up, I just wanted to show you some fun ways to step up your embossing folders, and then we'll create some cards. So the first basic way to use an embossing folder is to add ink into the embossing folder before you put the paper in. I like to use Hero Art's soft colored inks, but you could use any ink. I do find dye inks work a bit better. Now I am softly rubbing the ink onto the raised flat side of the embossing folder. And then I go around and I dab the ink on also. Once I have that covered generously with ink, I'm going to put in a piece of paper. I'm using a heavyweight cardstock for my examples today, but you can use what you have. Now notice when I put this into my die cut machine, I put it right on the platform and then put one cutting plate on top. And what we have is that light pool ink pressed into the paper in the valleys on the paper. And then the raised area is left white, and you can see the three-dimensional look that you get with these really cool embossing folders. But keep in mind, today's techniques work with regular embossing folders too, and I'll show you some examples later. Okay, another way you can step this up is to add ink to the raised areas also. Here I'm using Broken China Distress Oxide ink and an ink blending tool. However, you could use any ink you want. And I'm just lightly applying the ink to the most raised areas. So you end up with the soft pool ink in the valleys, the darker blue ink up on the raised areas, and white in between, which gives a beautiful dimensional look. It really enhances the dimension. One thing I wanted to mention about today's video is that most of my examples use super light colors because I like that elegant look with these embossing folders, but I wanted to quickly show you you can use brighter colors if you want to. Here I applied Gina K Apple Mint ink to the raised flat area inside my embossing folder, added some white cardstock and ran it through my machine, and you can see it works great with a more vibrant color also. And always be sure to wipe out the inside of your embossing folder to remove that ink. Okay, here's another 3D embossing folder. This one's just beautiful. It's a Sizzix Flower Heart Doodle 3D embossing folder. This is what it looks like just with white cardstock, which is just a beautiful floral cluster. However, I wanted to show you how you can also ink this one up with a soft vanilla ink from Hero Arts. Now notice this embossing folder has large flat areas. So it's going to be harder to transfer all that ink. So I'm going to run it through twice. So here's the first pass through. You'll see that the ink doesn't completely transfer to those large flat areas. That's okay, you can do it again. So if you find you get splotchy results, you can try this trick. So I'm inking up the same embossing folder with the same ink. I'll put the paper back in, lining up the flowers that are embossed on the paper with the raised flowers on the other side of the embossing folder. I will then carefully close it back up, run it through my die cut machine once again, and this time we'll have even more ink transferred and get better results. I really like this background and we'll turn it into a card in a moment. Okay, another technique for using your embossing folders creatively is to use pigment powders. First, I'm starting by putting soft vanilla ink back into that Botanical embossing folder, running it through with some white cardstock. And now to add some shimmer to this, I'm going to take my Versamark ink pad and just lightly rub it on all the raised areas. Just a soft application here. Once I've done that, I'll apply pigment powders. This is Perfect Pearl pigment powder. And I'll just brush this on top. And anywhere there is Versamark ink, this shimmer will stick. So you'll see in the raised areas we have this soft shimmer that's really nice in real life. And I did spray this with the fixative when I was done. Okay, next we have another 3D embossing folder. I wanted to show lots of different folder examples. This is the Sizzix Floral Bloom embossing folder. And I'm putting into this one Versamark ink. So on the raised flat areas inside the folder, I'm pressing Versamark ink, which is just a clear sticky ink, so you won't see it. I'll then put in my white cardstock, run it through my die cut machine, and that presses the Versamark ink into the valleys on our pattern. You won't see anything when you're done since it's a clear ink on white cardstock. However, I'm going to brush my Perfect Pearls over this again. And what will happen is I'll end up with shimmer in all the flat areas. And all the raised flowers will just be regular white cardstock. This would be beautiful for a wedding card. It's really soft and elegant. And I do spray that with a fixative when I'm done. Now, since it's very hard to see that shimmer on white in this video, I'll do it on blue also. So again, putting Versamark ink into the flat raised area of the embossing folder, putting my blue colored cardstock in it, and then running it through my die cut machine. Again, this presses the Versamark ink into the valleys on our final pattern. I'm then brushing on the Perfect Pearl pigment powder, and here you will better see that the pearl sticks to the lower flat area and the raised flowers are left without the shimmer. It's gorgeous and perfect for adding some elegance to your card. And I do spray that with a fixative, but you could leave it if you want to and just give it a soft light mist of water to help it stay. Okay, so I think it's time to make some cards, and I will show additional embossing folder techniques as we go. For all of my card designs, I created a frame to go around the embossing folder areas. So let's get started. I used, for this example, the My Favorite Things Elegant Rectangle die set. This is a great die set with lots of dies, and I took two that are next to each other in size. And on the back of those two dies, I'm putting some tape to hold them together so that I can die cut a bunch of frames with these two dies. So this purple tape will stay on the dies for multiple die cuts. I do put a little anti-static powder on the tape since so much tape is exposed, and I really only need the tape to hold the dies together. Okay, so let's go ahead and die cut about 5 or 6 of these frames. When I run it through my die cut machine, I will end up with the frame and that centerpiece. I actually only need one of those white centerpieces for this card. The rest I will save for future cards. Okay, now for the embossing folder technique. I'm using the Botanical embossing folder again. And onto the raised flat areas in the folder, I'm applying Gina K Sea Glass dye ink, putting one of those center die cuts in the inside and running it through my embossing folder. So remember, you can die cut any shape you want and put that in the folder if you prefer. And there you can see the beautiful results that you get with one pass through. Okay, next I am applying Versamark ink lightly onto the raised areas, just like I did on the early example with Perfect Pearls, but this time I'm going to apply embossing powder to it. So onto this, I'm adding Hero Art's White Satin Pearl Embossing Powder. This is a beautiful pearl powder, but you could use a shimmer or glitter embossing powder if you want. So anywhere there was the Versamark ink, this powder will hold. So I'll end up with that pearl look on the raised areas only of this piece. So it's hard to see in the video, but you can kind of see that pearl effect on the flowers and the leaves, and then the pool color ink on the flat areas. Now on one of my frames and on a Mama Elephant Hello script die cut, I press Versamark ink and I'm adding that same satin pearl embossing powder. That way my frame and my Hello die cut have that beautiful pearl finish to it, like the raised flowers do. Okay, so now we have the frame that fits nicely around our embossed piece. So now it's time to assemble that frame. So I'm using Gina Connect Glue. This is a great strong liquid adhesive that I like to use when I am stacking die cuts, so I get a nice thick dimension. However, you could have put a double-sided adhesive, such as Stick It, on the back of all your cardstock pieces before you die cut them. Then the adhesive would already be there. However, since I cut so many frames and I'm doing so many cards today, I thought that it would be more cost-effective to use the liquid adhesive. So I stacked up about 4 of those white frames. Now I'm adding that Hello die cut that we covered with the pearl embossing powder. And you'll see that the ends of it kind of hang off the edge. And on top of that, I will put our embossed frame. So it takes a little bit of time to create those frames and stack them all up, but it really gives beautiful results in the end. Okay, for the background of the card, I wanted a little interest, but nothing that distracted from our centerpiece. So I used the Lawn Fawn Itsy Bitsy polka dot die. This just cuts a piece that's about 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and it makes tiny little holes throughout the background. So I cut that from a soft pool cardstock, and then I added it on to a soft pool note card. Then I put our little framed piece right in the center using the Gina Connect adhesive, that strong adhesive. And I added some pearls into the background. Here you can see that pearl embossing powder on the raised areas of the flowers. It's really pretty in real life. I did add 1 tiny sentiment strip onto the framed area underneath the word hello. I felt it looked a little washed out without that little stamped sentiment underneath there, but you could definitely leave it off if you wanted to. So this shows how to add embossing powder to the raised areas that you create with an embossing folder. Here's a bonus card. This is the same kind of design, but I did the embossing folder technique in the middle a little differently. For this one, I started with a soft pool piece of cardstock, and I put it into an embossing folder with soft pool ink pressed onto it. After I ran it through, I have those beautiful raised areas, and on some of the raised areas, I added a little bit of my Tonic Aqua Shimmer pen, so the raised areas have a little bit of shimmer. Now for the frame, I used the same elegant frames from My Favorite Things as I did on the last example. I also used the Lawn Fawn die for the background. But for the sentiment, I used the Love You die set from Pretty Pink Posh. I thought that filled in the area nicely, and I die cut that from white cardstock and stacked 2 or 3 together to add to the card. And by the way, on all of my examples today, I used the embossing folder on the flap of my envelope so they would match perfectly. Okay, so let's move on to a different card design here. I again created a frame, but I used a frame die for this one, and I'll show you another embossing folder technique. This is the Memory Box Riverbank oval die. I die cut one from white cardstock, and I'm tracing the inside edge onto a piece of craft cardstock. I'm then going to cut out that piece so that I'll have a craft piece that fits inside that frame nicely. So I'm using the new Tim Holtz Lumber 3D embossing folder, and I'll put my oval in here without any ink inside the folder. After I run it through my die cut machine, I'll end up with this beautiful wood grain texture, but it is pretty subtle on this light colored cardstock. So to enhance that wood grain look, I'm using Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink and an ink blending tool, and lightly applying ink onto the raised areas. This really gives a gorgeous wood grain look. So now we can assemble our card. On the background, I wanted a little something, so I used this fun new Cat Scrappiness diamond wire die. It has great detail to it, and I cut it from that same craft cardstock and put it onto a craft note card. Okay, so now we can assemble our frame right on top of the card. I again created the frame by stacking 5 or 6 of those oval die cuts on top of each other and putting the embossed piece in the center. The die is made up of a Birch Press Hello Sugar Script die cut. I stacked 5 of those together also. And then I made a sentiment strip using this Hero Arts Support Prayers Love stamp set. So with this example, you can really see how adding ink to the raised areas of pieces that you created with an embossing folder adds so much to the texture. Here's another example. Remember this background? We created it earlier in this video, where I used the blue Distress Oxide ink to lightly apply ink over the raised areas. So I created a frame for that using a square die set, which I'll show you in a moment. And I also added a friend die cut to the center there, and I have about 4 or 5 of those stacked on top of each other. I really find that by stacking several of those word dies on top of each other, it stands out better against that busy background. And that die is from Pretty Pink Posh. Now for the sentiment strip, I use the Simon Says Stamp Simple Sentiments 1 stamp set. I use this a lot in videos, and it just adds a little bit of attention to the sentiment on the card. Now this is the die set that I used on that card to create the frame. This is a really cool set. It's from Reverse Confetti. It's called the Stitched Squares dies. Now you can use them together or separately. I used them together, so I ran 2 together at once to create the frames. But you could just run through 1 at a time and create a solid square with the stitching around the edge. And I like that it gives 3 lines of faux stitching. Here's another using that stitched die set. The piece in the middle I created just like the last example, but instead of rubbing blue ink on top, I rubbed fossilized amber distress oxide on top. So we have a blue in the background and the yellow on top. And I like that contrast. I added a stacked hello die cut to the center and also added a little missing you sentiment strip. Notice how I put the square on at a little bit of an angle to turn it into a diamond frame instead. I even was able to use the small squares that I created with that Reverse Confetti die square set to frame this small piece. Now this piece is one that I created earlier in the video where I used the soft vanilla ink with the embossing folder, and I added Versamark ink to the raised areas and added Perfect Pearl pigment powder. Underneath that, I just stamped a sentiment from the Jane's Doodles All Occasions stamp set. I like the sentiments in here. The size is nice, and it's a nice, simple font that works with a variety style of cards. So I was able to use all the squares that the Reverse Confetti die set created in order to make several cards. Okay, next up is my favorite card from today. I really like this embossing folder. Now for this one, I am using the piece I created earlier. Remember when I ran this through twice with yellow ink to make sure that it transferred completely? Well, I didn't want to repeat the process, so I just traced my frame die onto it with a pencil and cut it out, and now I have a piece that fits inside of my frame piece. So I assembled my frame just as I did earlier, with 5 or 6 of the frames stacked on top of each other, with the embossing folder piece in the center. Here I've created a hello die cut that has about 4 of them stacked on top of each other. It's from Pretty Pink Posh, and I'll glue that right onto the card. Again, by stacking several of those die cuts, it stands out better. This is that extra white embossed piece that I created earlier, and I glued that onto a white note card. And then I'm gluing my frame on top, lining up the pattern in the frame with the pattern in the background. I also added a small missing you sentiment underneath and a few pearls. I like how that embossed floral image stretches across the 2 pieces, the background and the frame piece. And the frame draws attention to the technique that we did inside. And remember that technique was very simple. I just put soft vanilla ink into the embossing folder before I ran it through, and it presses it into the paper. And of course, I used the folder on my matching envelope flap. Okay, another one of my favorite examples from today uses a fun frame die set, and it uses one of the pieces that we created earlier in this video. This is a My Favorite Things linked Octagon frame die set. I've been wanting to use this one for a while, and today's example was perfect for it. This one I'm going to use again in the future because I think it adds a lot of interest to a simple card. I used the large die to cut 5 die cuts and glued them on top of each other for a stacked look. I'm now gluing them onto a square card. This card is 4 3/4 by 4 3/4, and I'll use a 5 by 5 envelope for it. Now in this center, I'm using a piece that I cut from one of the pieces we created earlier in this video. This is the one where I put Versamark ink in the embossing folder and then added Perfect Pearl to that background. So I'll just pop this right into the center of the frame. I cut it to fit in the inside, and there we have a fun, unique frame for our embossing folder piece. Here you can get a better look at that piece, where it has that shimmer from the perfect pearls in the background, but the raised areas have less of the pearl and just allow the blue to show through. I'm really liking this look of framing in these pieces. So look at the dies that you may have, stacking dies or frame dies or window dies, and I bet you have something that would work for creating this focal point on your card. For this sentiment, I used the pretty pink Posh Love You die set again. I die cut 4 of those and stacked them on top of each other for dimension. That really helps to make it stand out. For the Hello Friend sentiment strip, I again used the Simon Says Stamp Simple Sentiments 1 stamp set. Here's another example with perfect pearls. This is the one that I made earlier in this video, where I put Versamark ink in my embossing folder, added the white cardstock and ran it through, then added the perfect pearl over it. So we have the shimmer in the background. It's very subtle but elegant in real life. So you can see that piece in the center of the frame. Now for the frame on this one, I used the pretty pink Posh Hello Shaker die. Now these types of frames are meant for shaker cards, creating a shaker window. However, they work great for just creating a frame to put like a focal point area on the inside. So I die cut 5 of these from white cardstock and glued them together, then did one with silver glitter cardstock and put it on top. I again used the Lawn Fawn Itsy Bitsy polka dot background die to create a white on white look. And check out that envelope. It's a silver metallic envelope where I used the same embossing folder, and it makes it match perfectly. Okay, here's another example with the same design. This one was very easy. For the background, I used the same embossing folder. I put pool ink in the folder and then put a piece of pool cardstock in the inside. So the background is a little bit darker than the raised areas. I added that to a white note card, and then I stacked up several of the pretty pink Posh Hello Shaker die cuts on top of each other and just glued that on the center of the card. So instead of framing a small piece, I just created a frame on top of a bigger piece. Now I know most of today's examples use a 3D embossing folder, a thicker one that adds lots of dimension. But these techniques work great with regular embossing folders, where there's raised areas and lowered areas. Here's an example. This is the Bohemian Bazaar embossing folder. I've used this one before. On the raised flat areas inside of the folder, I'm adding some of the Hero Arts soft pool ink, just like I've done many times in this video. I'm adding in a piece of white cardstock. Then I'm going to run this through my die cut machine. But since regular embossing folders are thinner, I put a cutting plate below and above when I run it through. So you'll just run this through however the instructions on your die cut machine say to do for embossing folders. There you can see the raised white areas, and even the back of the card is beautiful. Now you can step this up by adding ink on top. In this case, I'm just going to do direct to paper with a Gina K Apple Mint ink pad. I'm putting a lot of ink on this. When it dries, it'll soften a little bit, and look at that beautiful look that you get with the two-tone color, and all the raised areas are green. Traditional embossing folders like these are very inexpensive, and you can use many of the techniques that I showed you today with them as well. To turn this into a card was very simple. I trimmed it down a bit and added it to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch pool note card. In the center, I added the Birch Press Hello Sugar Script die cut. Now around it, I added the Avery Elle Oval Burst die. This is a great frame die cut that you can use with just about any card design, and I really like the slits that it cuts to add a little bit more interest. Okay, we're down to our last example. This one's very simple, but I wanted to show you that embossing folders work with a variety of cardstocks also, even specialty ones. In this case, I'm using a piece of silver cardstock. It has a shine to it, and I'm putting it in the Tim Holtz 3D Mechanics embossing folder. After running this through my machine, I get a really cool embossed look with that metallic feel. It looks like a piece of metal, but really it's just cardstock. Check out how cool that looks on the center of the card. So I added that piece onto a gray note card that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I again used the Avery Elle Oval Burst die to create a die cut frame for it. Now for the sentiment, I used the Simon Says Stamp Dude die set. I've used this in a video before. I used white for the shadow and black for the word dude. And I also added a little You Da Best sentiment strip underneath that. Check out how cool that embossing folder is also on the silver envelope flap. Okay, so there you have a bunch of different examples for using embossing folders on your cards. I hope this encourages you to try any embossing folders that you may have. If you're interested in these supplies, I always link them in my YouTube description below. But I encourage you to go to my blog. I'll have more photos there for you, more supplies there. I know this went through a lot of cards quickly, so you can check out more there. In the middle are a couple other embossing folder technique videos. I always appreciate you spending so much time with me. I hope it's worth it, and have a great day.